January 24th, 1945. 07:15 hours. Husson, France. The first shell hit the tree line and exploded. Trees disintegrated into 1,000 splinters. Frozen earth fountained 30 feet into the air. Then another shell. Then another. The German 19th Army had unleashed hell upon 3rd Battalion's 7th Infantry Regiment. 6 Tiger tanks rumbled forward through the smoke. Behind them, 700 German soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their rifles gleaming in the pale winter light. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. American soldiers huddled in their foxholes watching death approach. They had no tanks, no tank destroyers, nothing that could stop 6 60-ton monsters rolling toward them. In 4 minutes, the Tigers would reach their positions. In 4 minutes, 3rd Battalion would cease to exist. And then, one man picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. He was 5'6", 120 pounds, a tobacco farmer from Kentucky who never finished high school. His name was Garland Merle Connor, and he was about to do something so insane that even the artillery officers refused to believe him. He was about to call artillery fire on his own position. And somehow, impossibly, he would destroy all 6 Tigers, kill over 150 German soldiers, and save his entire battalion. This is the story of how a tobacco farmer became the second most decorated soldier of World War II. A story that was hidden for over 50 years. A story that almost no one knows. To understand what Connor did that frozen morning, you need to understand what 3rd Battalion was facing. It was late January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, but the Germans were not finished fighting. Hitler had launched Operation Nordwind on New Year's Day, the last major German offensive in the West. While the world focused on the Battle of the Bulge, 300 miles north, a smaller but equally desperate battle was being fought in Alsace. The Colmar Pocket was the last German-held territory in France. 850 square miles of frozen forest and farmland west of the Rhine River. The Germans had held it since November. Every attempt to eliminate the pocket had failed. The French First Army had lost thousands of men trying to push the Germans back. The ground was frozen solid. Digging foxholes took hours. Temperatures dropped to -15 at night. Soldiers developed frostbite within minutes of removing their gloves, and still the Germans held. 3rd Battalion had been on the line for 18 consecutive days. They slept in frozen holes when they could sleep at all. German patrols probed their positions every night. Snipers picked off anyone who raised their head during daylight. Artillery shells fell at random intervals day and night, keeping everyone on edge. The battalion had lost 43 men in 2 weeks. 43 soldiers dead or wounded without a single major engagement. Just the slow, grinding attrition of winter warfare. Morale was collapsing. Men who had survived D-Day and the liberation of France were beginning to crack under the constant pressure. And then came the morning of January 24th. German intelligence had identified 3rd Battalion as a weak point in the American line. The 19th Army assembled 700 infantry soldiers and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks for a devastating counterattack. The Tigers were the most feared weapons on the battlefield. Each one weighed 60 tons. Their 88mm guns could destroy any American tank from over a mile away. Their armor was virtually impenetrable to standard artillery. A single Tiger could hold an entire road junction against a company of infantry. 6 Tigers together represented an unstoppable force. The German plan was simple. Artillery would suppress the American positions. The Tigers would smash through the defensive line. Infantry would pour through the gap. 3rd Battalion would be annihilated. And then the Germans would push deeper into the 6th Army Group sector, potentially unraveling the entire Allied position in Alsace. It was not a complicated plan because it did not need to be. Against 6 Tigers, 3rd Battalion had no answer. No American armor was available. The nearest tank destroyers were 5 miles away, too far to help. The battalion's anti-tank weapons were useless against Tiger armor. Artillery was the only option, but artillery needed forward observers. someone who could see the enemy advance and adjust the fire. Without observers, artillery shells would land blindly, missing the targets entirely. The German barrage had already destroyed 3rd Battalion's forward observation post. The observers were dead or wounded. No one could see the German advance from the command post. The battalion commander stared at the map and saw disaster approaching. He needed eyes on the enemy. He needed someone forward of the American line. He needed a miracle. But miracles do not appear on military maps. Let me tell you about Garland Merle Connor. He was born in 1919 in Clinton County, Kentucky. Population, nothing. His family farmed tobacco on land that had been in the family for generations. The nearest school was 15 miles away. Connor walked part of that distance when he could, but education was a luxury his family could not afford. He never graduated from high school. By the time he was 20, he knew everything there was to know about growing tobacco and almost nothing about the wider world. He enlisted in the Army in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He was small, just 5'6" and 120 pounds. The Army almost rejected him for being underweight. But what the medical examiners could not see was the iron core beneath that slight frame. Connor was tough in ways that city boys could never understand. He had grown up working 16-hour days in tobacco fields under the Kentucky sun. He had survived winters without central heating, summers without air conditioning. He knew how to endure. The Army made him an infantryman. Then the war began and Connor started his journey through hell. He landed in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, Anzio, southern France, the Vosges Mountains, 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious assault landings. By January 1945, he had been in combat longer than almost any soldier in the European theater. He had been wounded 7 times. 7 times. Each wound sent him to the hospital. Each time, he returned to his unit. The Army eventually made him an intelligence officer, hoping to keep him behind the front lines. Intelligence officers gathered information about enemy movements, interrogated prisoners, analyzed patrol reports. It was supposed to be a safe job, but Connor refused to stay safe. When fighting started, he moved forward. He had earned 4 silver stars for direct combat action. 4 silver stars. Most soldiers never earn one. Connor collected them like other men collected battle souvenirs. October 1943. In Italy, he had charged a German machine gun position alone, killing the crew and capturing the gun. January 1944 at Anzio, he had carried a wounded soldier half a mile through enemy fire, while Germans shot at him the entire way. September 1944 in France, he had single-handedly destroyed a German observation post, killing 4 enemy soldiers with his carbine. The man had a gift for violence. Not cruelty, but the cold, precise application of force when force was needed. His soldiers trusted him absolutely. When Garland Connor moved forward, things happened. Germans died. Americans survived. It was that simple. 3 weeks before January 24th, Connor had been wounded again. Shrapnel from a German mortar round. The doctors sent him to the hospital, patched him up, told him to rest. He returned to 3rd Battalion 2 days before the attack. His wounds were still healing. He should have been recuperating in a warm bed somewhere far from the front. Instead, he was standing in a frozen command post, watching disaster unfold on the battalion's front. When the runner burst into the command post with news of the German advance, Connor made his decision instantly. He picked up a field telephone and 400 yards of wire. The battalion commander looked at him. Connor did not ask permission. He did not explain his plan. He simply walked out of the command post into the snow. 400 yards of open ground stretched between him and the German advance. Every inch of that ground was being swept by enemy artillery. The Germans had observers watching. They would see anyone trying to cross. Connor ran. His boots broke through the snow crust with each step. The telephone wire unspooled behind him, a thin lifeline connecting him to the American guns. At 100 yards, the German artillery found him. Shells landed 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. They were bracketing him, adjusting their fire. The next salvo would be closer. Connor kept running. At 250 yards, a shell destroyed a tree directly in his path. The trunk split down the middle. Half of it crashed into the snow. Connor vaulted over without stopping. Shrapnel was everywhere now, hot metal hissing in the frozen air. Another shell landed 15 yards behind him. The concussion wave hit him like a fist. He stumbled, but did not fall. 300 yards, 350 yards, 400 yards. He threw himself into a shallow ditch 30 yards ahead of the American front line. The ditch was barely 18 inches deep, not deep enough to stop bullets, not deep enough to protect against artillery, but it gave him a sight line toward the German advance. He cranked the telephone handset. The connection buzzed. Then a voice. The fire direction center 3 miles behind the front. 12 105mm howitzers waiting for coordinates. Connor gave his position. The fire direction officer confirmed. At that moment, Garland Merle Connor became 3rd Battalion's only hope. He raised his head above the ditch rim. The German infantry were 200 yards away. 700 soldiers moving through the trees in squad formations. Professional experience deadly. Behind them, the Tigers. Connor could see 4 of them now. Massive steel monsters pushing through the forest like the trees were nothing. The tank commanders stood in their turrets scanning for targets, and advancing directly toward a lone intelligence officer lying in a frozen ditch with nothing but a telephone. Connor lifted the handset. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open. 600 meters. Adjusting. The first shells would arrive in 40 seconds. If the Germans spotted him before the shells landed, they would kill him instantly. If the shells landed too close to his position, they would kill him anyway. If the shells landed too far from the Germans, 700 enemy soldiers would overrun 3rd Battalion, and everyone would die. Connor counted the seconds. 38, 39, 40. The sky screamed. 12 105mm shells hit the tree line 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. Connor grabbed the handset. Drop 100. Fire for effect. The second salvo landed 18 seconds later. This time, the shells hit the middle of the German formation. The forest erupted. Trees disintegrated. Shrapnel screamed through the air. 168 pounds of high explosive detonating simultaneously among 700 men packed into attack formations. German soldiers disappeared. The advance stopped. But this was only the beginning. The Tigers were still coming, and they were invincible to artillery fire. The real nightmare was about to begin. In Part 2, we will see how Connor faced the most terrifying weapons of World War II with nothing but a telephone and his own courage. We will witness the moment when he made the most insane decision of the entire war. The moment when Garland Merle Connor called artillery fire directly onto his own position. Stay with us. In Part 1, we watched Garland Merle Connor, a 120-pound tobacco farmer from Kentucky, run 400 yards through German artillery fire with nothing but a telephone and a spool of wire. We saw him throw himself into a shallow ditch 30 yards ahead of American lines. We watched him call artillery fire onto 700 advancing German soldiers. The first shells scattered the enemy infantry, but 6 Tiger tanks kept rolling forward. And those tanks were invincible to American artillery. Now Connor faced an impossible choice. The Tigers were 200 yards away and closing. Behind them, 700 German soldiers were regrouping. In front of him, American soldiers huddled in foxholes with nothing that could stop 60 tons of German steel. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the entire Second World War, and it would remain hidden for over 50 years. The Tigers advanced in a wedge formation, 2 tanks in front, 2 behind them, 2 more bringing up the rear. Tank commanders stood in their turrets scanning for targets. Their 88mm guns could destroy any American position from a mile away. Connor watched them push through the tree line like the forest was nothing. Small trees snapped like twigs under their tracks. Larger trees simply got shoved aside. 60 tons of German engineering rolling toward certain victory. Connor cranked the telephone handset. Enemy armor advancing. 250 meters. Adjust fire onto the tanks. The fire direction officer 3 miles behind the front hesitated. Artillery was not designed to kill tanks. Artillery saturated areas. It killed infantry in the open. It destroyed buildings. It cut communication lines. But tanks were small targets, fast targets, armored targets. The 105mm shells could damage a Tiger's tracks or optics, but they could not penetrate that armor. Not unless the shells landed exactly on target, and hitting a moving tank with indirect artillery fire was nearly impossible. The first shells landed around the Tigers. One shell hit 10 yards in front of the lead tank. The Tiger drove straight through the blast without slowing. Another shell landed behind the formation. The tanks kept coming. Their commanders knew American artillery could not stop them. They had survived dozens of barrages before. They would survive this one too. The lead Tiger fired. The 88mm gun cracked like thunder, splitting the sky. An American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right exploded. 3 soldiers dead in an instant. Another Tiger fired. Another foxhole obliterated. More Americans dead. Connor watched helplessly as the Tigers systematically destroyed his battalion's defensive positions. Each shot meant 3 or 4 dead Americans. The tanks were 300 yards from the American line now. In 4 minutes, they would reach the foxholes. Once they crossed the defensive line, 3rd Battalion would collapse. Tigers in the rear of American positions meant panic. Rout. Hundreds of soldiers running. The Germans would pursue. They would slaughter the retreating Americans. Then they would push deeper into the 6th Army Group sector. The entire front could unravel. All because 6 tanks were about to break through, and Garland Connor could do nothing to stop them. Or could he? Connor studied the terrain. The Tigers were using the forest for partial cover, staying among the trees. But to reach the American positions, they would have to cross 200 yards of open ground. Once they left the tree line, they would be exposed, vulnerable. If he could put enough shells on them at exactly the right moment. But that would require the shells to land dangerously close to his own position. Extremely close. The artillery battery was firing 105mm shells. Each shell had a lethal shrapnel radius of 50 yards. Anyone standing within 50 yards of an impact point would be shredded by flying metal. Connor was lying in a ditch, 18 inches deep. If the shells landed within 30 yards of his position, the shrapnel would pass directly over him. If they landed within 20 yards, the concussion alone might kill him. If they landed any closer, he would not have to worry about the Germans anymore. Connor lifted the handset. His voice was steady. Drop 50. Fire for effect. The fire direction officer repeated the coordinates, then stopped. Those coordinates would put the shells within 50 yards of Connor's position. The officer asked Connor to confirm. Connor confirmed. The shells arrived 18 seconds later. The explosions hit 40 yards out, close enough that Connor felt the heat on his face, close enough that shrapnel screamed through the air above his head. The concussion wave pressed him into the frozen earth. His ears rang. His vision blurred, but he stayed in the ditch. He kept the handset pressed to his ear. One Tiger took a shell on its right track. The track broke. The tank slewed hard and stopped, immobilized. Another Tiger took a hit on the engine deck. Smoke poured from its rear. 4 Tigers remaining. Still advancing. Still coming to kill him. The tank commanders had spotted the telephone wire trailing across the snow. They knew someone was directing the American artillery, and they were adjusting their course. They were coming straight toward Connor's ditch. He was about to do something that violated every rule of artillery fire. He was about to call shells directly onto his own position. Fire on my position. The fire direction officer went silent. Then he repeated the coordinates back. He asked Connor to confirm. Connor confirmed. The officer asked him to confirm again. This was not standard procedure. This was suicide. Artillery observers did not call fire on themselves. It meant certain death. Connor confirmed a third time. 40 seconds later, the sky fell. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion wave hit like a freight train. Connor's body lifted off the frozen ground. His lungs compressed. His vision went white. Frozen dirt and shrapnel screamed overhead. The sound was beyond thunder, beyond anything human ears were meant to hear. It was the sound of the world ending. Connor stayed in the ditch. Drop 20. Repeat fire. The next salvo landed 20 yards out, close enough that he could feel the heat scorching his exposed skin, close enough that metal fragments tore through the air 6 feet above his head. If he raised his body even slightly, he would be cut to pieces. The Tigers stopped advancing. The tank commanders had buttoned up, slamming their hatches closed. Artillery was landing too close. Even Tiger crews did not want to be outside their armor when shells were detonating at point-blank range. But Connor could not let them stop. He needed to keep them pinned. He needed to destroy them before they recovered. He adjusted fire, left 10 meters. One shell hit the center Tiger's turret. The armor held, but the impact damaged the turret ring. The turret would not traverse anymore. The tank could only fire straight ahead. Useless. Another Tiger lost its second track. 2 broken tracks meant the tank could not move at all. The crew abandoned the vehicle. 5 German tankers scrambled out and ran toward the tree line. American machine guns opened fire from the foxholes. 3 tankers went down. 2 made it to cover. 3 Tigers destroyed. 3 remaining. And 700 German infantry soldiers were rallying behind the armor. Connor could see them forming up again. Company strength, maybe 200 soldiers who had survived the initial barrage. They were using the Tigers for cover, staying behind the massive tanks, moving when the tanks moved. The German attack was continuing. Connor shifted fire. He walked the shells back and forth across the German advance. Every time a group of infantry tried to move forward, he dropped shells on them. Every time the remaining Tigers advanced, he called fire directly in front of them. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. Connor had been lying in the ditch for over an hour now. His hands were numb. His feet were numb. Every time a shell landed close, frozen dirt rained down on him. It got in his eyes, in his mouth. The handset was slippery with ice, but he kept calling fire. 40 minutes and a private from the battalion intelligence section crawled out to join him. The private brought extra telephone wire and a backup handset. He lay 5 feet to Connor's right, watching for German infantry calling out positions. 2 men in an 18-inch ditch against 700 Germans and 3 Tiger tanks. The German artillery found them. German observers had finally pinpointed Connor's exact position. Shells began landing 20 yards behind the ditch. Then 15 yards. Then 10 yards. The Germans were walking their fire toward him. In another minute, the shells would land directly on the ditch. Connor called counter-battery fire. He gave the coordinates of the German artillery positions 3 miles behind the German front line. The American guns shifted targets. The German artillery fire slackened, then stopped. The counter-battery was working. But now, German infantry was inside 50 yards. Connor could hear their officers shouting commands in German. He could hear the bolt actions on their rifles clicking. He dropped the artillery another 10 yards. The shells landed between him and the advancing Germans. 60 yards from his position, the blast waves hammered him. Something hit his left shoulder. Shrapnel or a rock? He could not tell. His shoulder went numb. He switched the handset to his right hand. The German advance stopped again. 2 hours had passed. The battlefield had become a lunar landscape. Shell craters, overlapping shell craters, shattered trees, burning vehicles, bodies everywhere, German bodies. The 3 remaining Tigers made one final push. They spread out 50 yards between each tank, making themselves harder targets. They were 200 yards from the American foxholes, then 150 yards, then 100 yards. Connor called for maximum concentration. every gun the battery could bring to bear on a single target. The leftmost Tiger took a direct hit on the front glacis plate. The armor held, but the driver lost control. The tank slewed into a crater and stuck. The center Tiger took multiple hits to the tracks. Immobilized. The crew tried to keep fighting, but American machine gun fire forced them back inside. The last Tiger, the final Tiger, reached 60 yards from the American line. Its machine guns opened up, suppressing every defensive position. Connor gave coordinates that put the shells within 40 yards of his own body. The salvos landed. Shrapnel screamed past him. A fragment embedded itself in the frozen earth 2 inches from his right hand. The Tiger's vision blocks shattered. The driver was blind. The tank swerved and crashed into a crater. The crew abandoned the vehicle and ran. All 6 Tigers were destroyed or abandoned, but 400 German soldiers remained. They kept fighting for another hour. Small groups tried to flank Connor's position. Each time he called fire and scattered them. At one point, German soldiers reached within 30 yards of his ditch. Connor dropped shells 25 yards out. The concussion lifted him off the ground. The private beside him screamed. Shrapnel had torn through his leg. Blood poured into the snow. Connor pulled the private deeper into the ditch. The private refused to leave. He stayed watching for Germans, his leg bleeding into the frozen earth. 3 hours after Connor had left the command post, the German attack finally broke. The surviving Germans began pulling back, dragging wounded comrades, leaving their dead behind. Connor kept the shells falling, pursued them, made sure they kept running, made sure they understood that coming back meant death. The final count was devastating for the Germans. 53 enemy soldiers confirmed dead on the field. Another 78 wounded left behind during the retreat. Total German casualties estimated at over 150 killed and wounded. All 6 Tiger tanks destroyed or abandoned. 3rd Battalion lost 11 soldiers, killed 23 wounded. Most of those casualties occurred during the initial German barrage before Connor reached the ditch. After he began directing artillery, American casualties stopped. One man with a telephone had broken the German attack. One tobacco farmer who never finished high school had destroyed 6 Tiger tanks. The battalion commander met Connor at the foxhole line. The commander looked at the battlefield, looked at Connor, and could not find words. He simply nodded. Medics took the wounded private away. Connor walked back to the command post. His shoulder was still numb. A medic removed a piece of shrapnel, bandaged him, told him he was lucky. Connor said nothing. 3rd Battalion remained on the line for 8 more days. The Germans did not attack again. They had lost too many men, too many tanks. The Colmar Pocket Offensive was over. On February 10th, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. Patch commanded the entire 7th Army. He had come to 3rd Battalion specifically to honor Connor. The battalion commander had recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork went up through division, through corps, through army. But the award process was slow, and Connor was being sent home. He had been in combat for 28 consecutive months, wounded 7 times. The army was rotating him back to the United States. On March 15th, Connor left France. He sailed home. He was discharged in June. And then Garland Merle Connor did something remarkable. He simply disappeared. In Part 3, we will discover what happened to the second most decorated soldier of World War II. We will learn why Connor hid his medals in a cardboard box for 50 years. We will meet the man who accidentally discovered those medals in 1996. And we will witness the 20-year battle that Connor's widow fought to get him the Medal of Honor he deserved. A battle against the United States Army itself. A battle that went all the way to federal court. A battle that ended with a government attorney breaking down in tears. The war was over. But the fight for Garland Connor's legacy was just beginning. In Part 1, we watched Garland Merle Connor run 400 yards through German artillery fire with nothing but a telephone. In part 2, we saw him call artillery on his own position for 3 hours straight. He destroyed 6 Tiger tanks. He killed over 150 German soldiers. He saved his entire battalion. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross and 4 Silver Stars. He became the second most decorated soldier of World War II. And then he went home to Kentucky and never spoke of it again. For 50 years, Garland Connor kept his medals in a cardboard box inside a duffel bag in the back of his closet. For 50 years, no one knew what he had done. Until one afternoon in 1996, when a stranger opened that box and the truth finally came out. But getting the world to recognize Garland Connor would prove harder than anything he faced in that frozen ditch. This is the story of a 20-year battle that went all the way to federal court. A battle fought not by soldiers, but by a widow who refused to let her husband be forgotten. Connor sailed home from France on March 15, 1945. The transport ship took 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic. He arrived in New York in early April. The war in Europe ended May 8th. Connor was already home, already trying to forget. The Army discharged him on June 22, 1945. He was 26 years old. He had been in combat for 28 consecutive months. He had participated in 10 major campaigns, 4 amphibious assault landings. He had been wounded 7 times. The Army gave him a stack of medals and sent him back to Kentucky. Albany, Kentucky held a parade for him in May. The whole town turned out. They honored their returning hero. Alvin York spoke at the ceremony. York was the most famous Medal of Honor recipient from World War I. He had come from Pall Mall, Tennessee, just 50 miles from Albany. York understood what Connor had done. He understood the weight of it. He looked at the small tobacco farmer standing quietly at the podium and saw something familiar. The same haunted look, the same reluctance to speak. York knew that the men who had seen the worst of war rarely wanted to talk about it. Connor met a woman at the parade, Pauline Wells. She was 20 years old, beautiful, curious about the quiet soldier everyone was celebrating. She had heard the medal citations read aloud. She could not believe the stories. The man standing before her was 5'6", 120 pounds. He looked like he should be working in a general store, not destroying Tiger tanks. She approached him after the ceremony. They talked. Connor did not mention the war. He talked about farming, about the land, about the tobacco crop that would need planting soon. Pauline was charmed by his simplicity, his gentleness. Nothing about Garland Connor suggested violence. Nothing suggested he had spent 3 hours calling artillery fire onto his own position while German soldiers tried to kill him. They married on July 9, 1945. 2 months after meeting, they moved to a farm on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany. No electricity, no running water. They worked the land with mules and horses, tobacco and corn, the same crops Connor's family had grown for generations. It was a hard life, but it was peaceful, and peace was what Garland Connor needed. Pauline asked him once early in their marriage, "What happened in France? What did you do to earn all those medals?" Connor looked at her for a long moment. His eyes went distant. Then he said 6 words that would define the next 50 years. "I did what needed to be done. That was all." He would not elaborate. He would not explain. He would not discuss January 24, 1945, or the ditch, or the Tigers, or the 700 German soldiers who tried to kill him. The memories stayed locked inside his head. The medals stayed locked in a cardboard box. Pauline learned not to ask. She saw the nightmares. She heard him cry out in his sleep. She understood that some wounds never heal. The shrapnel in his shoulder had been removed. The frostbite in his fingers had faded. But the things he had seen, the things he had done, those stayed with him forever. Connor threw himself into work. He became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau, held the position for 17 years. He helped other farmers with crop rotation, soil conservation, dealing with the agricultural bureaucracy. He was active in veterans organizations, Paralyzed Veterans of America, Disabled American Veterans. He traveled to nearby counties, helping veterans file claims for benefits. He gave back to others who had served. But he never talked about his own service, never mentioned his own medals, never told anyone what he had done in that frozen ditch. In 1950, the government bought their farm. Lake Cumberland was being created. The reservoir would flood Indian Creek. Connor and Pauline moved to the Rowland community in southeastern Clinton County. Started over. New land, new crops, same quiet life. The years passed. Korea came and went. Vietnam came and went. Connor watched younger men go to war and come home broken, just like he had. He understood their silence. He shared it. The cardboard box stayed in the closet. The medals gathered dust. By 1996, Connor was 77 years old. Diabetes had ravaged his body. Kidney failure was slowly killing him. The doctor said he had maybe 2 years left. Pauline watched her husband fade. 51 years of marriage. 51 years of silence. She had never seen those medals displayed. Never heard him brag. Never watched him tell war stories at the VFW hall like other veterans. Garland Connor had simply erased that part of his life. And soon she thought it would be erased forever. Then Richard Chilton wrote a letter. Chilton was a veteran researching his uncle Private Gordon Roberts. Roberts had been killed at Anzio in January 1944. Chilton had learned that Roberts served in the same unit as Connor. He wanted to know if Connor remembered anything about his uncle's final days. Connor invited Chilton to visit. They sat in the living room of the small farmhouse. Connor was frail now, a shadow of the man who had run 400 yards through artillery fire. But his memory was clear. He told Chilton about Anzio, about Roberts. Connor had carried Roberts to a medical aid station after Roberts was hit by shrapnel. He had stayed with the young private until he died. As Connor spoke, his voice began to crack. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. 52 years later, and the memory still broke him. Chilton sat in stunned silence. He had come looking for information about his uncle. He had found something else entirely. He had found a man carrying 50 years of grief in absolute silence. Pauline suggested Chilton look through Connor's military records. Maybe there would be more information about Roberts in the official documents. She brought out the duffel bag from the closet, the cardboard box inside. Chilton opened it. His hands began to shake. Distinguished Service Cross, 4 silver stars, Bronze Star, Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre, medal after medal after medal. Chilton read the citations. His face went pale. He looked at Connor, then at Pauline, then back at the medals. He said one sentence that would change everything. This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Pauline stared at him. She had known her husband was decorated. She had seen the medals once decades ago, but she had never understood what they meant. She had never read the citations carefully. Chilton explained. The Distinguished Service Cross was the second highest award for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. Connor's actions on January 24, 1945, exceeded the requirements for the DSC, running 400 yards through artillery fire, directing fire for 3 hours from an exposed position, calling artillery on his own position, destroying 6 Tiger tanks, saving his battalion. These were Medal of Honor actions. Somehow, somewhere in the military bureaucracy, Connor had been shortchanged. Chilton was not a man who accepted injustice quietly. He was a veteran himself. He understood what medals meant. He understood what Connor had done. He began gathering documents, filing paperwork, building a case. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records could upgrade awards if new evidence emerged. Chilton found eyewitness statements from soldiers who had served with Connor, men who had watched him from the foxholes that frozen morning, men who had seen him lying in that ditch for 3 hours while German shells tried to kill him. Their statements were clear. Garland Connor deserved the Medal of Honor. The board rejected the application in 1997. Not enough evidence, they said. The witnesses were old. Their memories might be faulty. The original recommendation had been for the Distinguished Service Cross, not the Medal of Honor. Changing it now would require extraordinary proof. Chilton appealed. The board rejected the appeal in 2000. Connor died on November 5, 1998. He was 79 years old. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany. The Distinguished Service Cross went with him. He never knew about Chilton's efforts. He never knew anyone was fighting for his Medal of Honor. He died thinking his service had been properly recognized. He died not knowing he had been cheated. But Pauline did not stop. Her husband was gone. His medals were buried with him. But his legacy remained. And Pauline Connor was not a woman who gave up easily. She had spent 51 years married to a man who never quit, who never surrendered, who lay in a frozen ditch for 3 hours rather than retreat. Some of that stubbornness had rubbed off on her. She collected more eyewitness accounts. Found 3 soldiers who had been in the foxholes on January 24th. Men in their 80s now, but their memories were sharp. They remembered Connor. They remembered the ditch. They remembered watching one man hold off 700 Germans with nothing but a telephone. She resubmitted the case in 2008. Nothing happened. Years passed. Historians joined the fight. Authors wrote about Connor. Stephen Ambrose mentioned him in his work, called his actions far above the call of duty. The Rhode Island Senate passed a resolution in 2005 calling for the Medal of Honor. 7 retired generals endorsed the application. Still nothing. The Army bureaucracy was immovable. The paperwork sat in files. Nobody acted. In 2014, Pauline Connor did something unprecedented. She sued the United States Army in federal court. She was 85 years old. Her husband had been dead for 16 years, and she was taking the United States government to court to get him the medal he deserved. The judge ruled against her. She had waited too long, he said. The statute of limitations had expired. Pauline appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case went to mediation. And then something extraordinary happened. During the proceedings, the government attorney assigned to fight Pauline's case broke down crying. Her father, she revealed, had served in 3rd Battalion 7th Infantry Regiment. He had been wounded on January 25, 1945. One day after Connor's action. One day after Connor had stopped the German counterattack. The attorney looked at Pauline and said 5 words through her tears. Connor might have saved my father. In Part 4, we will witness the final chapter of Garland Connor's story. We will see Pauline Connor, 89 years old, standing in the White House. We will watch a president place the Medal of Honor around her neck. And we will discover the extraordinary legacy of a tobacco farmer who never wanted to be remembered. A legacy that almost disappeared forever. The war ended in 1945, but Garland Connor's final battle took 73 years to win. In Part 1, we watched Garland Merle Connor run 400 yards through German artillery fire. In Part 2, we saw him call artillery on his own position for 3 hours, destroying 6 Tiger tanks and killing over 150 German soldiers. In Part 3, we followed his widow Pauline as she fought the United States Army for 20 years, trying to get her husband the Medal of Honor he deserved. We left off with a government attorney breaking down in tears during mediation. Her father had served in Connor's battalion. He had been wounded one day after Connor's action. The attorney looked at Pauline and said 5 words. Connor might have saved my father. Now we reach the final chapter. A chapter that would take 73 years to write. A chapter that proves sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with paperwork, persistence, and love. The mediation changed everything. The government attorney could not continue fighting Pauline's case with the same conviction. How could she argue against the man who might have saved her father's life? The Army Board for Correction of Military Records agreed to review Connor's case one final time. This time, they had everything. Eyewitness statements from 3 surviving soldiers who had watched Connor in that ditch. Official military records documenting the German attack. Artillery logs showing the fire missions Connor had called. Medical records proving he had been wounded during the action. letters from 7 retired generals endorsing the upgrade, a resolution from the Rhode Island Senate, endorsements from military historians across the country. The board recommended the upgrade in 2015, but even then the process was not complete. Federal law required a time limit for Medal of Honor awards. Connor's action had occurred in 1945. The deadline had passed decades ago. Congress would need to pass special legislation to waive the time limit. Pauline was 86 years old. She had been fighting for 19 years. She refused to stop now. Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky introduced the legislation. The bill passed both houses of Congress. President Obama signed it into law. The waiver was granted. Garland Merle Connor could finally receive the Medal of Honor. But the actual presentation would wait for the next administration. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced the award. On June 26, 2018, Pauline Connor walked into the East Room of the White House. She was 89 years old. Her husband had been dead for 20 years. She had spent 22 years fighting for this moment. 22 years since Richard Chilton had opened that cardboard box. 22 years of paperwork rejections, appeals, lawsuits, and tears. She wore a simple dress. Her hair was white. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood before the assembled crowd. President Trump read the citation aloud. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The words echoed through the room. Volunteered to run 400 yards through enemy fire. Directed artillery for 3 consecutive hours from an exposed position. Called fire on his own position when enemy forces closed to within yards. Directly responsible for eliminating over 150 enemy soldiers and destroying all 6 enemy tanks. The president placed the Medal of Honor around Pauline's neck. She held it gently, looking down at the blue ribbon and golden star. This medal belonged to her husband, a tobacco farmer from Kentucky who never finished high school. A man who had kept his heroism hidden in a cardboard box for 50 years. A man who died thinking his service had been properly recognized, never knowing he had been cheated of the nation's highest honor. Pauline spoke briefly to the press afterward. She said Garland would have been embarrassed by all this attention. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted to come home, work his farm, and live in peace. But he deserved this medal. He earned it. And now finally, he had it. The Medal of Honor went to the Clinton County Historical Society in Albany, Kentucky. It sits in a display case alongside Connor's other decorations. The Distinguished Service Cross, 4 silver stars. The Bronze Star, 7 purple hearts. The French Croix de Guerre. Visitors can see them now. They can read about what he did on January 24, 1945. The secret that stayed hidden for 50 years is finally known. But the descent of Garland Connor extends far beyond medals and museums. His actions that frozen morning saved not just his battalion, but potentially thousands of lives. Consider what would have happened if Connor had not picked up that telephone. 6 Tiger tanks would have broken through 3rd Battalion's defensive line. The battalion would have collapsed. 700 German soldiers would have poured through the gap. The German 19th Army would have achieved its objective. The American position in Alsace would have been compromised. The Colmar Pocket Offensive would have succeeded instead of failed. The war in Europe might have lasted weeks or months longer. Every additional day of fighting meant more deaths. American deaths, Allied deaths, German deaths, civilian deaths. Military historians estimate that the Colmar Pocket operation cost the German army approximately 22,000 casualties. The pocket was finally eliminated in February 1945, just weeks after Connor's action. If the German counterattack on January 24th had succeeded, those numbers would have been different. The timeline would have shifted. The cascade of consequences is impossible to calculate precisely, but the arithmetic is clear. Connor's 3 hours in that ditch changed the trajectory of the battle, and battles that change trajectories save lives. The principles Connor demonstrated that day are still taught in military academies around the world. Forward observation under fire. The calculated acceptance of risk. the willingness to sacrifice personal safety for mission success. Artillery officers study his fire missions as examples of precision under pressure. Leadership instructors use his story to illustrate initiative and courage. The United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, has incorporated Connor's actions into their curriculum. Young artillery officers learn how one man with a telephone can be more decisive than a battalion of tanks. They learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. Connor was terrified in that ditch. He had to be. German shells were landing within yards of his position. Tiger tanks were advancing directly toward him. 700 enemy soldiers wanted to kill him, but he stayed. He kept calling fire. He kept adjusting for 3 hours. That is what courage looks like, not fearlessness. Persistence despite fear. Connor's story also teaches us something about recognition and humility. He never sought the Medal of Honor. He never complained about receiving the Distinguished Service Cross instead. He never wrote letters to newspapers or congressmen demanding his due. He simply went home, married. Pauline farmed his land and helped other veterans when he could. The medals meant nothing to him. The recognition meant nothing. What mattered was that he had done his duty. He had saved his friends. He had survived. Everything else was irrelevant. This attitude is increasingly rare in our modern world. We live in an age of self-promotion where every achievement must be broadcast, every accomplishment must be celebrated, every act of kindness must be documented and shared. Connor represents a different ethic, the ethic of quiet service, the ethic of doing what needs to be done without expecting applause, the ethic of letting your actions speak while your mouth stays silent. 50 years of silence. 50 years of keeping his medals in a cardboard box. Not because he was ashamed, but because he saw nothing to boast about. He had done what any soldier would do. That was how he saw it. But here is what Connor could not see. He could not see that his story would inspire generations of soldiers who came after him. He could not see that his example would be studied at West Point and Sandhurst and military academies on 5 continents. He could not see that a government attorney would break down crying because her father's life might have been saved by his courage. He could not see that his widow would fight for 22 years to get him the recognition he deserved. He could not see that his Medal of Honor ceremony would be watched by millions of people around the world. He thought his story ended on that frozen morning in 1945. He was wrong. His story was just beginning. And there is one final detail that most people do not know. One twist that makes Connor's story even more remarkable. When Garland Connor died in November 1998, he was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany, Kentucky. His Distinguished Service Cross was placed in his casket. He went into the ground wearing the second highest award for valor the nation could give. But here is what no one expected. When the Medal of Honor was finally awarded in 2018, 20 years after his death, the Army faced a question. The medal needed to be presented. But Connor was gone. His remains were in the cemetery. Normally, the Medal of Honor is placed around the recipient's neck. But you cannot place a medal around the neck of a man who has been dead for 2 decades. The solution was unprecedented. Pauline Connor received the medal on her husband's behalf. But the medal itself was designated for permanent display at the Clinton County Historical Society. It would never be buried with Connor. It would stay above ground, visible, accessible, so that future generations could see it and learn his story. And here is the twist. In the same display case that holds Connor's Medal of Honor, there is a photograph that Pauline donated along with the medal. It shows a young couple on their wedding day. July 9, 1945. Garland Connor, 26 years old, skinny short, wearing a borrowed suit. Pauline Wells, 20 years old, beautiful, smiling, her whole life ahead of her. They are standing outside a small church in Kentucky. Neither of them knows what the next 53 years will bring. Neither of them knows about the cardboard box. Neither of them knows about the 22-year legal battle. Neither of them knows that their love story will eventually reach the White House. They are just two young people starting a life together. That photograph hangs next to the Medal of Honor because Pauline wanted visitors to understand something. The medal represents courage in war. But the photograph represents something equally important: courage in love, courage in loyalty, courage in fighting for someone who can no longer fight for himself. From a tobacco farmer who never finished high school to the second most decorated soldier of World War II, from a cardboard box in a closet to the East Room of the White House, from 3 hours in a frozen ditch to 73 years of waiting for justice. Garland Merle Connor's story is not just about military heroism. It is about the quiet courage that sustains us through ordinary life. It is about wives who fight for their husbands and strangers who open cardboard boxes, and government attorneys who cry when history becomes personal. Connor saved his battalion on January 24, 1945. But Pauline saved his legacy on June 26, 2018. Both acts required courage. Both acts required sacrifice. Both acts changed history. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are hundreds of forgotten heroes from World War II whose stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to discover more of these hidden histories. And remember Garland Merle Connor. Remember the tobacco farmer who ran through artillery fire with a telephone. Remember the man who called shells onto his own position rather than let his friends die. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is a tobacco farmer lying in an 18-inch ditch while the world explodes around him, pressing a telephone to his ear, whispering coordinates, refusing to quit. That is courage. And that is why we remember.